It sure is wonderful to see everyone tonight. Glad that we can have another period of worship and study together. We're going to be looking tonight at a very interesting figure in, I would say, the Old Testament. We're actually going to be looking in the New Testament, but you understand what I mean when you see the name on the screen. We're going to be looking at Melchizedek and trying to understand some of what is said about Melchizedek, particularly what is said about him in Hebrews chapter 7. Now, I do think there are some lessons we can learn, but this isn't so much a, what do we need to do, how do we need to live type of a lesson. This is more of this is a confusing topic, but it's something that we would do well to learn a little more about. And so we're going to just spend some time trying to dig a little deeper and get a better understanding of this honestly rather mysterious figure named Melchizedek. So as we begin tonight, if you would be turning over to Hebrews chapter 7, I want to briefly read through the first part of this chapter together as we kind of get an overview of what the Hebrews writer wants to tell us about this individual. We'll start in verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 7. He's already mentioned Melchizedek a little bit in the previous chapter or two, but now he kind of dives into a lot of detail about it. He says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have this descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is written, 'You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek.'" If that sounds familiar, that's a quote from Psalm 110, which we talked about briefly this morning as we prepared to take at the communion. Now, that was a lot. We're not going to dissect every single little piece of that. If we ever do a class on Hebrews, we might go into more detail of the text of Hebrews, but I want to just focus in on what's said about Melchizedek. If we go to Genesis, we see the event that the Hebrews writer is describing. Basically, there were some kings who attacked Sodom where Lot was, and Lot being a relative of Abraham, Abraham goes to war to rescue Lot. And as they're coming back after having won the battle, this priest meets them, named Melchizedek. And Abraham gives him tithes of the spoils of the battle. And Melchizedek blesses Abraham. And that's really all there is. So it's just this very seemingly random episode in the Old Testament where you have this priest. He's not part of the law of Moses because there is no law of Moses yet. But Abraham clearly gives him honor as a priest of the one true God. And he is described in Genesis as a priest of the one true God. Not just any God, but the God. And so we have this description then in Hebrews. We have the Hebrews writer talking about there's this individual. He's without father, he's without mother. We'll get to that in a second. All these descriptions of him. He's the king of peace. He's the king of righteousness. And Abraham, and even Levi, in a sense, because Levi is descended from Abraham, they honored him even though Levi would ultimately be the one from whom the priests of the law of Moses would come to be. So how do we begin to unpack this? How do we even begin to understand who Melchizedek was or why it even matters? I want us to start by perhaps reviewing for some of us, but reminding ourselves, in any case, what exactly is the role of a high priest? Now notice, it doesn't technically describe Melchizedek, unless I missed something, as a high priest. It just describes him as a priest, but he was the sole priest in his order, I guess you could say, right? You don't have this system. You see reflected later what Aaron and his descendants would do, very similarly to what Melchizedek would do. So I just want us to think about what a priest, and specifically what a high priest, would do as we begin to think about Melchizedek. Notice in Exodus, as the Levitical priesthood is established, what does God want to happen in this system that he's establishing for the priesthood? He says, so Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel in the breastplate of judgment on his arm, when he goes into the holy place to bring them to regular remembrance before the Lord. Now, if you remember the breastplate he's talking about, it had these 12 precious stones, and one of the tribes was written on each one of the stones. But do we see the point that we're being given here? What is Aaron's job in this verse? What is the job of the priest? Well, as it's stated here, the job of the priest is to bring the people before the Lord. What do we call that? What do we call it when someone represents one group of people before another group of people? It's a mediator. It's a go-between. It's someone who connects. It's someone who brings together. So the priests under Aaron, the Levitical priesthood, the law of Moses establishing this priesthood, the priest's job is to connect God and the people. But there's another aspect to it, right? Notice in Leviticus 16, this is a description of a specific type of offering, but I think it helps us make the point. Then he, this is a reference to the priest, then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions, all their sins. So the priest is meant to be a mediator between God and men. That's what a priest does. Ultimately, that's what any priest does. Even in the pagan priesthoods, that was the basic idea, this idea of a representative between God and men. But there's another aspect to it besides that, right? If you think about priests, unless you're thinking about priests that exist today, if you're thinking about priests in ancient times, there's got to be some sacrifices in there somewhere, right? That's the other side of this. Why do you sacrifice, though? In many of the pagan religions, you would sacrifice just to appease the gods, right? You keep them happy so that they are nice to you. Very twisted system. If it was a relationship between two people, we call it a toxic relationship because it was very just twisted and unhealthy. But that's not how God is described when he asks for sacrifices. When God asks for sacrifice, it's because there's been sin. The sacrifices are offered by the priest, this go-between, in order to deal with this sin. Well, what do we have here? As we're beginning to see the connection that the Hebrews writer is giving us, we have this individual Melchizedek. He is described as a priest, a mediator between God and man, and one who would offer sacrifices. We also have Aaron and his priesthood, a mediator between Israel and God, and the one who would offer the sacrifices. Well, now we have Jesus. There's one God and one mediator between God and men, the man, Jesus Christ. Well, so he fulfills that aspect of priesthood. But then we have this other aspect. This is again referring to Jesus later on in the same chapter of Hebrews. He, speaking of Jesus, has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Okay, so not only is Jesus a mediator, he connects God and man, but he offers sacrifice. But not just any sacrifice. He offered himself. Most of this is not new information to us yet, right? But that's what a priest does. The question we should be asking at this point, because we probably have heard this before, the comparison between Jesus as a priest and the priesthood of Aaron, the priesthood of whatever, but here the Hebrews writer is not comparing Jesus to just any priest or even to Aaron. He's comparing him to this man Melchizedek. So he's a priest, sure, but why Melchizedek? Well, first, if we're going to answer that question, we understand that Jesus works as this high priest between God and man, the sacrifices. Christ is perfectly qualified for both of those, but in order to understand why we're talking so much about Melchizedek, we need to know who Melchizedek was, right? So let's ask the question. Who was Melchizedek? There have been a lot of theories on this. I don't know if you've ever heard some of the theories, but it's interesting to think about. The Hebrews writer specifically gives us some interesting questions to ask. When we look in Genesis, all we're told is, oh, here's this priest, right? He just kind of shows up. But how does the Hebrews writer describe him? Let's look again. Well, first of all, let's look in Genesis. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Again, just very matter of fact, he's there and then he's gone. But notice in Psalm 110, even before we have this reference in Hebrews, the Psalms, the Old Testament speaks of the coming Messiah, not as someone who will be from the priesthood of Aaron, but someone who will be from the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So there's so much focus on this individual, but even when we get to Psalms, we're not really told who this individual was. And then we get to this description of Melchizedek in Hebrews. He is, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. That's what Melchizedek, the word itself, the name itself, that's what it means. And he is also the King of Salem, that is, the King of Peace. If you remember, our word Salem, that's the Hebrew word shalom. That's where it comes from. Peace. Think about those two descriptions. The King of Righteousness, the King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. Now this is where the theories start, right? If you have someone, and if we are taking this very literally, if you have someone who is described as the King of Righteousness, the King of Peace, he doesn't have parents or a genealogy, he doesn't have beginning or end, well, it sounds like we're talking about someone who's supernatural, right? Honestly, I've gone back and forth over time, in the past I've gone back and forth over who I thought Melchizedek was. There are some who would argue this was actually an appearance of Jesus in human form before, Christ came to earth as Jesus Christ and lived and died in the first century. As a foreshadowing, if you will, of himself. But the more I've studied it, the more I think there's more to it than that. How did the Jews establish who belonged in the priesthood? Well, first of all, you have to be of the tribe of Levi. And then, specifically, if we're talking about the high priest, you have to be a descendant of Aaron. Well, Levi and Aaron both died a long time ago, the further and further you go on in Israel's history. So how do you know if you're of the tribe of Levi or of the family of Aaron? Genealogy. Who's your father? Who's your mother? Right? Well, Melchizedek, we don't have a record of any of that. There is no genealogy for Melchizedek. I would argue, and there are people who disagree, but I would argue in this context, the Hebrews writer is not telling us he literally didn't have parents. He's telling us we don't know who his father was. We don't know who his mother was. We don't know his genealogy. We don't know when he was born. We don't know when he died. We just have this one little snippet of this priest. We don't have all the stuff that we have for Aaron or for other leaders of Israel. He's simply a priest. And he's a priest who serves on the basis of what? Righteousness and peace. Do we see what we're being told here? Essentially, what we're being told is who Melchizedek was doesn't really matter in terms of who the actual person was. But the role he played is exactly what matters. He was a priest, not connected with any of these things that the Jews later came to associate with priesthood. But that's why God wanted this Messiah, this new priest, Jesus. That's why he wanted him not to be of the order of Aaron, but to be of the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek's not an angel or a member of the Godhead or something like that, I would argue. Again, there's those who disagree. I respect that. But I think in the context, the point of Melchizedek is that he's a priest of God who served before the law of Moses and who served based on, in a sense, a different way of thinking about God and the relationship of God and man. What does Paul say about the old law? What was the old law intended for? It's sometimes described as a schoolmaster or tutor, right? To bring us to Christ. But ultimately, how else does Paul describe the old law? Slavery. Slavery to ritual. Slavery to something that was never intended to be permanent. In fact, Hebrews in particular, that's the whole point, right? Christ is better. So he's going back all the way to Genesis to help us understand we should be looking at Christ not as a successor of someone like Aaron, but something completely different. So that's why we have to then, as we begin to wrap up, ask ourselves, why is he a priest after Melchizedek and not after Aaron? What's the point of making this clear and distinct comparison and contrast between the two? Notice, it's interesting. Whenever Aaron is established as a high priest, what is he told? Well, Moses is told, "You shall gird Aaron and his sons with sashes and bind caps on them, and the priesthood shall be theirs by a statute forever." That's interesting, isn't it? It shall be theirs forever. So how in the world can you have a priest that's not part of Aaron's line? Well, let's keep going. Notice, Aaron was set apart to dedicate the most holy things, that he and his sons forever should make offerings before the Lord and minister to him and pronounce blessings in his name forever. Again, it sure seems like this is a very permanent situation. But notice, going back to Hebrews 7, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? And here's the key. For where there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Do we see what he's saying? Oh yeah, Aaron and his sons are priests forever. Well, forever as long as the law lasts. What happens if You don't have Aaron and his sons as priests anymore. Well, you must not have the same law anymore. So if you remove the Mosaic law, by necessity, you remove the priesthood of Levi and the priesthood of Aaron. What do you have left? There's only one other time you have a priest of the Most High God mentioned in Scripture. And that's Melchizedek. Melchizedek, who, because he received honor from Abraham, is recognized in that sense as being better than Abraham and those who would come in Abraham's line, the children of Israel. Not better in the sense of inherently better as a human being. But I want us to think about something very interesting. We have Christ as the priest, the order of Melchizedek, because Melchizedek's priesthood was similar, or rather superior, to Aaron's. Why? I don't want us to misunderstand the description I'm about to give, but I do think it's helpful. In the beginning, God creates the universe. He creates mankind. Mankind and God are in perfect harmony with one another. They're in full fellowship. And then sin enters the world, and there's a separation. But even through that separation, there are still times of hope. People who give hope, right? In the days of Seth, for example, men began to call on the name of the Lord. The whole earth is evil, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Abraham was found as a man of faith. So we see that even in that evil, people are seeking out the Lord. However, there is a need for a tutor, a schoolmaster, to bring us to Christ. And so that's when you have the law of Moses instituted. And that begins to implement ritual in all of these things. And by the time of Jesus, what has happened? Why does Jesus chastise the Pharisees so often? Because they pay more attention to the ritual than what the ritual is meant to get them to think about. They become so focused on the specific behaviors and rituals and commandments that they've missed the point. But then all of a sudden we've moved from full fellowship with God to sin and to the standard of ritual. Then we have the cross. The rituals are released, and all of a sudden we're moving back, not towards a priesthood like Aaron's, but towards a priesthood based on righteousness and peace. A way of being in contact with God, not through all of these specific ordinances that Paul talks about so often, that ultimately were slavery, but instead a way of connecting with God through righteousness, through peace. Remember what he said to the Pharisees? You tithe the herbs, the mint, the anise, the cumin. You've neglected the weightier matters like mercy and justice. Melchizedek's priesthood is superior because now we're back full circle, not in an identical sense, but drawing back to a personal relationship with God that was lost in the garden. No, we're not heading literally back to the garden. Some would argue that we're literally heading back to such a thing. We're heading back to what the garden represents. Not a relationship with God disguised with all these elements of ritual and ordinance between us. But even as we ourselves are considered priests, we have the throne room open to us, as the Hebrews writer continues throughout his book. We are granted access personally because we don't have to go through Aaron and his sons. Christ has instituted a different priesthood, a different law, and it's a better one. Ultimately, that is the point, really, of the whole book of Hebrews, isn't it? Christ is a better high priest of a better covenant, and we are blessed to be part of it. And that's why he spends so much time, even though it can be confusing for us to work through, that's why he spends so much time talking about this interesting, mysterious figure. He's trying to get us to think outside of these things that we're familiar with. I know we aren't familiar with it as in we've been Jews before and been under the law, but we've read our Old Testaments. We know all these laws that they had to go through. And he's trying to pull us back out of that and get us to think about something different and see why that law of Moses was never meant to be permanent. It was always meant to lead to something better. And unlike many of our forefathers, we get to live in that something better. And we should always rejoice because of it. Again, this is not a lesson designed to provoke us to action per se. It's designed to help us better understand what we have in Christ and what has been done for us through the plan of God. But if there is something that's going on in your life that we can help you with as we are all trying to serve God and enjoying the blessings of the priesthood of Christ, we would love to help you. Please let us know if there is something we can do as we stand and as we sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His